Nobody would have ever guessed that a white skateboarder would make massive roads towards reconciling racial relations and bringing everyone together in America. Things on social media have seemed to get worse when it comes to racial disparity once you factor in poverty, the economy, healthcare, education costs, food prices, crime, addiction, and even debt. This isn't anything new to most people living in the US, but the tricky part is that people are afraid to talk about things to find answers because no matter what color your skin is, there's this fear that if you say the wrong thing, you might get condemned by cancel culture. Humor has often been used as a way to spark that hard conversation about race-related issues and get the dialogue going. Comedians like Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock aren't afraid to hit those uncomfortable talking points and get us to laugh at our own ignorance. But stand-up comedy isn't the only outlet for these difficult topics. They also unfold on social media for those with enough courage to do so. This is basically what happened back in 2018 when a Twitter user, Silent Hooper, tweeted an image from the 1990s crime drama New Jack City that featured actor Wesley Snipes as his character Nino Brown standing over a friend of his in the movie that he's about to shoot in the head. Along with that image of Nino Brown tearing up while holding a gun, Silent Hooper joked that when a race war comes, black people will be really struggling with the idea of having to kill Tony Hawk, a white male in his 50s who happens to also be the most famous professional skateboarder in the world. The Silent Hooper meme made its rounds through people's Twitter feeds and penetrated far enough to get the attention of Tony Hawk himself. Then things got really interesting in October of 2018 when Tony Hawk saw the race war meme and humbly responded by saying, "I appreciate the hesitation though." Now let's jump ahead 4 years to the infamous Academy Awards in March of 2022 where Will Smith slapped Chris Rock. Another story that came out from that event that was overshadowed by the slap heard around the world was when pictures of Tony Hawk and Wesley Snipes popped up online that Tony Hawk posted from the Academy Awards ceremony. Tony Hawk informed Wesley Snipes about the previous race war meme that involved the two of them. They both found the humor in it and posed in pictures shaking hands. Tony Hawk posted the pics on Twitter with the caption that read, "I was spared. Life is good." Some people outside the world of skating or just popular culture, perhaps outside of America, may be scratching their heads trying to understand what Tony Hawk has to do and with becoming so popular among black Americans that he might get spared in a hypothetical apocalyptic race war. It's as if this one meme thrusted Tony Hawk into that rare group of white celebrities that are so widely liked that they seem to connect with black audiences without even trying, such as Robert De Niro, Dolly Parton, and even Betty White. But during times when names like Donald Trump and words like woke have been transformed into triggering terms that divide people culturally, it was refreshing to be able to add a name like Tony Hawk to the other side of the divide and have it stand for things like unity to bridge the gap and bring people together. But before we go too far and assume why the most famous skater on the planet suddenly ended racism, let's take a look at why people would get that idea in the first place. Tony Hawk was born in 1968 in San Diego, California, and was known as a hyperactive kid with a lot of energy. Skateboarding was a hobby of Tony's that his parents supported because it was a way to channel all that extra energy in a productive way. It was more than paid off. By age 14, Tony was already skating professionally, and by 16, he was getting sponsored by brands like Vans, Sundeck, and Tracker. Tony Hawk took his passion so seriously that he held his position as the National Skateboard Association World Champion for 12 years in a row. So how many teenagers in the 80s were earning more than their teachers, averaging over $100,000 a year from prizes and sponsorships? In fact, Tony Hawk was even able to buy his family a house while he was only a senior in high school, all from skateboarding. With a net worth currently that's anywhere in the hundreds of millions, Tony Hawk is by far the wealthiest professional skater in history. In fact, his estimated wealth is more than double that of the next most richest skater, which was Rob Dyrdek, whose net worth sits at around the estimated mark of $50 million, although these things are always inaccurate. Among those money-making endeavors that skateboarding afforded Tony was his video game series that revolutionized video game soundtracks with a mix of rap and rock, paving the way for this to be a popular formula in video games such as Grand Theft Auto franchise, hip-hop heavy NBA Live game soundtracks. But before we get deeper into Tony Hawk's Pro Skater game series' impact on breaking down racial barriers, let's look at the relationship between hip-hop and skating before Tony Hawk's first game launched in 1999. When the Beastie Boys' first album, Licensed to Ill, was released in 1986 on Def Jam, it became the highest-selling hip-hop album up until that point. It stood out not just because of the group consisting of 3 happy-go-lucky Jewish rappers, a rarity at the time, but also because the Beastie Boys were coming from the punk rock scene in New York City and weren't shy about skateboarding. You have to imagine a hip-hop scene about 2 decades before Pharrell Williams was calling himself Skateboard P, or Lupe Fiasco had an anthem called Kick Push, and before the Vans, Skater, Sneaker Rock, and Tyler the Creator was even born. In fact, 1986 was about 10 years before there was even an active skating industry on the East Coast. Beastie Boys members MCA, Ad Rock, and Mike D weren't pro skaters back then, but skating was an authentic part of how they dressed and how they rolled in promotional photos. Skating in the middle of the 80s was still mostly a California thing, and the music associated with it being heavily in the punk rock vein, promoted by compilation albums and Thrasher magazine. But with the Beastie Boys first emerging as a punk band in the early 80s, their evolution into rap made them a bridge for kids on either side of the cultural divide to cross over. This became especially true in 1992 when the Beastie Boys' music became less about being frat boy favorites and became more heavily influenced by funk and rock on their third album, Check Your Head, an album that even featured skating in their music video for Pass the Mic. This was the era where they got back to live instruments and were pioneering the retro skater look in hip-hop with knitted hats, flannel shirts, graphic tees, and hoodies. Beastie Boys member Mike D was also involved in the promotion of the Extra Large brand and clothing store in Los Angeles, a skater hangout that sold hard-to-find sneakers and apparel with the gorilla logo before an ape was part of the imagery for the Japanese Bait brand. In many ways, the Beastie Boys helped lay the groundwork for the lane that Tony Hawk's Pro Skater video game would establish further in the early 2000s, which was basically skateboarding being a reason for suburban white rock kids and urban kids into hip-hop to meet in the middle. So those earlier days, before its mainstream acceptance, skateboarding was considered a counterculture youth activity, and Tony Hawk inherently understood that. Skateboarding was counterculture, so skaters were interested in a different kind of soundtrack, the kind of do-it-yourself against the establishment thing. I was excited to dig deep into the culture and lifestyle of skating, and the music that went along with that I grew up listening to at the skate park. On the first game, my influence was mostly the older punk stuff. The dynamic mixture of hip-hop meets rock didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't a simple task to bring those early Tony Hawk tracks to life for gamers. Brian Bright, an associate producer of the video game publishing company Activision, handled in-house audio and somehow managed to cobble together the soundtrack for the first Tony Hawk Pro Skater game for about $30,000. In order to understand how far he made that music licensing deal stretch for the 1999 game, the same $30,000 today might only clear one song for usage. When the first game was later adapted for the Nintendo 64 gaming system following year in 2000, Brian Bright stated that, "Back then, the PlayStation had a CD drive with about 650 megabytes of usable space. I cut up the songs into the smallest bite-sized sample bits I could, and then sequenced those samples to recreate the song. It was one of the first Nintendo 64 games to have licensed music in it, not specifically composed for video games." Ludwig Göhr, director of the documentary Pretending I'm a Superman, the Tony Hawk video game story, defined how the legendary gaming series connected with the often misunderstood skater culture. It was definitely more of a hardcore art form. It was kind of an us versus them mentality. The skaters knew what they were doing and nobody else understood their culture. As the game got released, suddenly the mainstream was exposed to their music, their tricks, and their culture. And the first game featured some real-life spots in San Francisco in particular. When it came out, it all changed. Skaters were blown away because now your average Joe suddenly had a sense of what every trick was, what they meant, and what they looked like. By the time Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 rolled out in September of 2000, hip-hop music began to play a bigger role in the game, with Public Enemy's Bring the Noise with Anthrax from the Apocalypse 91, the Enemy Strikes Back album, Pin the Tail on the Donkey by Naughty by Nature, and lesser-known tracks like Subculture by Styles of Beyond and B-Boy Document 99 by The High and Mighty featuring Mos Def and Mad Skills. With each new edition of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, the predominantly rock-centric soundtracks made more and more space to welcome hip-hop to the soundtrack. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 paired songs from rockers like Red Hot Chili Peppers and the Ramones with Del the Funky Homo Sapiens' If You Must, KRS-One's Hush, Redman's Let's Get Dirty, and Exhibit's Paparazzi. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 dug even deeper into the crates with a unique blend of hip-hop classics from the 80s and early 90s like My Adidas by Run DMC, Express Yourself by NWA, Oodles of O's by De La Soul, By the Time I Get to Arizona by Public Enemy, and Mass Appeal by Gangstar. There were also underground gems like Labor by A$AP Rock, Big Shots by Idea and Abilities, Non Campos Mentis by Haiku Du Etat, and When I'm on the Mic by Loot Pack. When the series expanded to include the Tony Hawk Underground titles, there were over 70 songs on the soundtracks that fairly evenly split the track listings between the hip-hop, punk, and rock genres. Between Tony Hawk Underground and Tony Hawk Underground 2, gamers were exposed to a diverse mix of music from Nas, Brand Nubian, Grand Poobah, The DOC, Atmosphere, Jurassic 5, Juggernauts, J Live, Pete Rock and CL Smooth, The Sugar Hill Gang, and Ultramagnetic MCs. Very underground acts, not even mainstream for rap. Even though these games were dropping during an era when Jay-Z, Kanye West, and 50 Cent were huge in hip-hop, the soundtracks didn't lean on the current platinum hits to sell more games, still living within that identity of counterculture. The music was more like these interesting Easter eggs that people were discovering that they may have never even heard of before. It helped to make the games feel more like an authentic world that they were entering into and less commercialized, just like the culture it was depicting. The respected underground lyricist Ari the Rugged Man may not have been much of a skater, but he became aware of how skating has become an entry point for outsiders to get connected to hip-hop, while even appearing in a soundtrack as well. In Long Island, there was a lot of us kids who used to try to skateboard. Some of them wanted to become pro, and a couple of them were wild and would break their skateboards. I did a skate song for the Tony Hawk video game though. There's a song called King of the Underground, and a lot of skateboard kids never heard of me until that song. I was in California in a studio and some woman said, "Hey, we're in charge of this Tony Hawk video game. A whole bunch of people will hear it." I was invited to come through and record for it. When I handed it in, it wasn't really supposed to be about skateboarding. It was supposed to be more just a song to put in there. But they took it anyway, and I'm rapping about doing ollies and kick flips and skate or die. There's a lot of, say, mid-30s to early 30s type of white boy producers who kind of came up on, oh, I was skater, and we'd hear Gangstar's album and this album. Then they'd randomly all of a sudden started making beats. They didn't come up on the New York battle rap scene, but they kind of learned hip-hop through skateboarding with their crew. I'm looking at the Tony Hawk King of the Underground right now, and I say, we fall off boards, break bones, get cut up, twist ankles, get bloody, but we get right up, leap, twist, pop, shove it, old school. You couldn't curse on it. You couldn't be an ignorant, belligerent guy on it. But it worked out. Chicago trend-setting rapper Lupe Fiasco caught a bit of attention in 2006 with his song Kick Push, which was more directly a link between hip-hop and skating than anything that hit the mainstream before it. Oddly enough, Lupe says he initially caught a bunch of backlash for it. There were some very insecure skaters, Tony Hawk not being one of them, fortunately, who just felt like I was trying to encroach on their territory when I really did the song as a tribute for a skate shop. It was never supposed to be a single, never meant to be a single. It was for a skate shop called Uprise for a Skate DVD, and then it just took a life of its own. But when you're the first through the wall, you always get a little bloody. Then it paves the way for Lil Wayne's and all the other people to kind of come in and capitalize on the culture, even 10 times more than I did. From there all the way up until now, I always try and make things that I'm personally attached to have a personal vibration with me that I feel are real and honest, and wherever that takes me. So whether that's skateboarding or having a grandmother that passed away from cancer and homies that are fighting it right now to make a song like Mission, it's all in the same boat. Mercules, a prolific Canadian rapper who released music on Death Row Records in 2022, is another hip-hop artist who experienced the influential impact of Tony Hawk's gaming franchise. The Mercules track Bass, featuring Hobson and Tech 9, was featured in the 2020 version of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2. The rapper from Surrey, British Columbia, Canada, was first exposed to Public Enemy and rock groups like Rage Against the Machine, Anthrax, and Papa Roach while playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. 2 decades later, he went from loving the soundtrack to becoming a part of one. I mean, no shade to anybody on the soundtrack, but I definitely went into the settings and made it so only my song played for an hour. It's a surreal thing. And it's crazy. Being a person that found most of the music that I first learned about through that game is just really cool now that I'm a part of it. It's definitely a bucket list thing for me. There's no other game that I would want to be more a part of than Tony Hawk, because that's all I played. I dedicated so many hours into that game. Pharrell Williams called himself Skateboard P on 2004's Drop It Like It's Hot, popularizing his camouflage trucker hat and Billionaire Boys Club t-shirt skater look. But little did we know that Skateboard P wasn't Pharrell trying to jump on a Tony Hawk-inspired bandwagon to sell records. It was actually a nickname that people were calling him when he was still in high school in his hometown of Virginia Beach. In the song's music video, Pharrell also raps, "See these ice creams," as he points to his feet to reveal a pair of blurred-out sneakers. P didn't just showcase his ice cream brand of skater kicks produced in partnership with Reebok. Ice Cream would also be the name of Pharrell's skate team with the likes of Terry Kennedy, Jacob Wilder, Jimmy Gorecki, and Skateboard P's own brother, Kato Williams. During an episode of Pharrell's podcast called Other Tone, he got to interview a man who was quite an influence on him during his youth and adulthood, Tony Hawk. They discussed the growth of skateboarding, Tony's game, and the connection with hip-hop, where Tony Hawk stated, "There are just as many skaters as there are rappers, and there are a million rappers, and there's a million skaters and a million decks now. Skateboard P, I give you so much credit for raising awareness, for bringing a whole new audience in and having them embrace it. Like, I thank you for that." Pharrell and Tony Hawk have both used their work as a stage to promote unity and humanity. Tony Hawk is the founder of the Tony Hawk Foundation, which is also referred to as the Skate Park Project, which has established over 600 skate parks, particularly to benefit underprivileged communities all around the world. Pharrell has connected with the Adidas brand for his human race, with social justice as part of the messaging. With racism being an evil catalyst for inequality and lack of opportunities, it's fascinating to see how skateboarding took both Tony Hawk and someone he helped to inspire, Pharrell Williams, helped to diversify skating and break down barriers within hip-hop as well. In the late 90s and early 2000s, during the rise of Pharrell, his production crew the Neptunes, and his band NERD, hip-hop was more firmly fused with skate culture. Not only do you see this expressed on the Jonah Hill-directed film Mid-90s, loosely based on his own teen years as a hip-hop loving skater, but this cross-cultural mixture is also in the work of the deceased artist Virgil Abloh, who, while working as the creative director of Louis Vuitton, signed on pro skateboarders to design shoes. While skaters began getting bigger sponsorship opportunities when the X Games competitions emerged in 1995, it was the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater video games, with the first one debuting on the PlayStation gaming system in '99, that introduced skating culture to the world. In fact, the Tony Hawk video game series has raked in over $1.6 billion in sales, helping to turn something that was once underground into an extreme sport that's made its way to the Olympics. This led to fans of the video games getting further immersed in skate culture, learning the names of the board brands, the tricks, everything. Along with Tony Hawk, Rodney Mullen is well regarded as one of the most influential skaters in history, and his likeness is available as a playable character in Pro Skater 2. Believe it or not, Rodney Mullen was on the verge of quitting skateboarding until he was given the opportunity to be featured in the game, one of the creators of many skateboard tricks people use today. Mullen says that when he told Tony he was giving up because he busted his ankle, not only did Tony Hawk assure him that this wasn't a serious setback worth worrying about, but he also changed Rodney Mullen's life by offering him the chance to be in the game. The increased fame that came with being a video game character may have also potentially saved Rodney Mullen's life as well one night during a late skating session in a sketchy section of LA, when two big guys approached Rodney who stated they had this look that said, "This is going to be bad." And then all of a sudden, one of them just goes, "Wait, aren't you the guy in that game?" He went to the body language of a little kid, asking me if I could do this trick or that trick. It was a crazy thing. My point is that when the game came out, not only did it blow up the existing community and our place in it, it also brought an awareness and a respect for skaters to outsiders, especially with the language. That's what connected with me. They taught people our language. I stand pretty strongly by the idea that skateboarding is not a sport. We're an entire culture with a specific language and a way of doing things and expressing who we are. Not some competition that shows up every year, Street League, the Olympics, more power to them, but that's not the whole picture. Another popular professional skater, Chad Muska, also sees the way Tony Hawk games dispelled a lot of stereotypes about the world of skating and the people that partook in it. Initially, when anybody thought of skateboarding, they thought white people, punk rock, and California. These cultural barriers were being broken down. Skateboarding is like music. You could be a pool skater or a street skater, a vert skater or a park skater. You could be an emo skater who's into The Cure or a SoundCloud rapper kid who listens to underground rap. That's what really makes a professional skateboarder. When kids look up to that person as a role model and emulate their style and want to dress like them, skate like them, and listen to the same music as them. A recent study out of the University of Southern California revealed that Black American skaters and skaters of other ethnicities felt safer and judged less negatively when they had skateboards in their hands. The research study was funded by the Tony Hawk Foundation, and it was co-authored by Naftali Williams, who stated, "Having a young person of color holding a skateboard and feeling safer walking through white neighborhoods or other spaces where they could be perceived as threatening. To me, that's amazing to actually see that they can actually feel that there's some safety, that there's some just level of security coming from them holding skateboards that they wouldn't have if they were holding a football or bouncing a basketball. If we continue to push skateboarding and build a platform for skateboarding, that means that there are ways that people can come together and just have some little hints of beginning conversations or dialogues. And most importantly, it keeps Black people alive, because skateboarders are deciding to opt into this constructed identity of the skateboarder when that happens. That means they have a global community, and that's something we as adults need to focus on and make sure we're supporting. With skateboarding, you now get the reason to communicate together, the reason to have shared space, and the reason to want to learn about someone else's background because you have a shared love for the activity. You can build a skate park in the neighborhood. You can make sure that the little incubator is a space for everyone to be involved. And that's a little effort you can do, is building the skate park and not policing the skate park and making kids feel bad for being at a skate park. So what was it about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games besides the music that helped so many gamers put their thoughts about race on pause and focus on their shared interests instead of their differences in appearances? For one, the commonalities between hip-hop and skating include the exploration of the urban landscape, getting bullied by authorities that tend to view both groups as a problem. They're considered outsider subcultures that the mainstream has profited off of but don't necessarily treat with too much dignity, or are an annoyance at best. Some celebrities just try way too hard to get support from a certain community, going as far as changing how they dress, talk, and act, only to be considered a fraud when their hearts aren't in the same place. But Tony Hawk earned his hip-hop pass without changing who he is at all. As journalist Zarin Burnett says, "The Tony Hawk game was where a lot of people first heard rappers and groups they'd come to love. Most of all, though, it's clear that he loves us. Sure, other celebrities like Miley Cyrus love us too, but they love as symbols and so that they can do all of our stuff for clout and profit. It's not like that with Tony Hawk. If one Black person says they'd hate to have to kill him in the race war, he doesn't make a joke about the race part. He jokes about that personal act of hesitation. He gets the joke precisely because he doesn't treat us as, quote, Black people. Instead, Tony Hawk sees us as people who are Black. That's why Tony Hawk has a lifetime invite to the cookout, because he never tries to get an invite. We like a white man who understands that cops can be assholes, that Wesley Snipes gets to decide if you live or die, and why being able to laugh at yourself is probably the best way to survive in America, because otherwise, these streets can kill you." It's not very often that someone who became a super rich white guy from outside activities that are traditionally popular among African Americans earns a seat at the quote-unquote proverbial cultural table where his skin color doesn't raise any red flags, for that matter. But with so many people looking for genuine ways to show why racism is wrong, it's refreshing to see Tony Hawk accomplish this without using race relations in any capacity whatsoever. Not as a marketing gimmick to keep his name in the headlines, not as a way to make his name more appealing or to seem more charitable. There are enough people on social media that tell people what to say, think, and how to act when discrimination is concerned, and a lot of them miss the point. If we treated each other fairly and with respect, just because it's the right thing to do, out of shared interests and welcoming spaces into those shared interests, perhaps society would get a step closer to ending racism. For real. And not just for a profitable means of a trendy hashtag or movement.